The ledger hit the desk so hard that the inkwell rattled, and a thin crack split the morning silence of the Monroe Ranch office like a gunshot. Wilhelmina Carver did not flinch. She stood with her spine perfectly straight, her dark eyes locked onto Tobias Monroe's face with a steadiness that had taken her years of hard living to acquire. The leather-bound book lay open between them, its columns of numbers arranged in neat rows that told a story more devastating than any argument either of them could have spoken aloud. "You are 3 months from losing everything," she said. Her voice was quiet. That was the most terrifying part of it, the absolute quiet in her voice, because it meant she was certain. Tobias Monroe pushed back from the desk and rose to his full height, which was considerable. He was 6 feet and 2 inches of sun-hardened rancher, with broad shoulders built by 15 years of working cattle in the Texas hill country, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone that made up these hills. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, pale and sharp, and currently filled with a fury she recognized as the fury of a man who had just been cornered by the truth. "I did not ask for your assessment, Miss Carver," he said. "I did not ask for you at all. My foreman sent for you without my knowledge or my permission, and I intend to have a long conversation with Hector about that the moment you walk out that door. Your foreman sent for me because he has watched this ranch hemorrhage money for 2 years and he does not want to see it die," Wilhelmina said. "He sent for me because he is loyal to you, Tobias Monroe, even when you are too proud to be loyal to your own future." The use of his first name hit him like a slap. Nobody in this county used his first name without invitation. He was Mr. Monroe to his hands, Monroe to the men he did business with, and nothing at all to the women of Caldwell County, because women of Caldwell County generally kept a respectful distance from a man with his particular reputation for solitude and stubbornness. "I do not need a partner," he said. The words came out flat and final as a closing door. Wilhelmina reached past him and turned the ledger so its columns faced him directly. "Then explain to me," she said, "how you will pay the cattle note that comes due on the 15th of September. Explain to me how you will cover the feed debt at Morrison's store, which is currently 9 months outstanding. Explain to me how you will keep your best 3 hands through the winter when you have not paid full wages since March. Explain all of that to me, Tobias Monroe, and I will walk out that door and never trouble you again." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Wilhelmina had heard since she arrived in Hargrove County, Texas, in the autumn of 1883. It stretched between them like a wire pulled too tight. And in that silence, everything that had led them to this moment began to arrange itself, the way the pieces of a long-hidden secret finally fall into their proper places. Wilhelmina Carver had come to Texas on the back of a grief she never spoke about. She had grown up in Missouri, in a household that ran more on ledgers and figures than on warmth, which was not an altogether unhappy thing, because it meant she developed a gift for numbers that most men in the territory would have traded a good horse to possess. Her father, Gerald Carver, had been a bank examiner in Jefferson City, a precise and methodical man who believed that the difference between a person who survived hard times and a person who did not was almost always found in whether they understood where their money was actually going. He had taught Wilhelmina everything he knew. He had also died of a fever in the winter of 1880, leaving Wilhelmina at 22 with a sharp mind, a modest inheritance, and no particular plan for what to do next. Her mother had passed 3 years before that, so there was no family to return to, no safe harbor to wait in while she figured out her next steps. There was only the question of what a woman with her particular set of skills could do in a world that was not entirely certain it wanted her to use them. She had worked as a bookkeeper in St. Louis for 2 years, for a dry goods merchant who paid her fairly and treated her with professional respect, which she found more valuable than flowers or compliments. She had saved carefully. She had also watched the frontier press carry story after story about the land boom in Texas, about the cattle fortunes being made and lost, about the wild and complicated economy of a state that was still figuring out what it wanted to be. When the merchant retired and sold his business to a man who did not believe in employing women in positions of financial authority, Wilhelmina had spent exactly one evening feeling sorry for herself. Then she had packed her trunk, purchased a train ticket to San Antonio, and begun the next phase of her life. She had built her reputation as an independent accounts examiner slowly and carefully. She worked for a hotel owner in San Antonio first, untangling 3 years of muddled bookkeeping that had hidden a quiet embezzlement by his head clerk. The discovery saved the hotel owner $800 and earned Wilhelmina a recommendation letter that opened the next door. After that, there was a cattle broker in Austin, a mercantile in Fredericksburg, a small bank in Bowen that needed its records reconciled after its founding partner died unexpectedly. She was 26 now, experienced and efficient and entirely accustomed to walking into situations that men found complicated and finding the clean line through them. She had not, however, been entirely prepared for Tobias Monroe. The request had come through Hector Vasquez, the Monroe Ranch foreman, who had heard of her work from the cattle broker in Austin. Hector had written her a letter so carefully worded that it took her 2 readings to understand that he was asking for help without his employer's knowledge. He had described the ranch, the Double M, as one of the finest cattle operations in the Texas Hill Country, currently struggling through a period of financial difficulty that he believed was correctable, but that his employer was too proud to address directly. He had also mentioned, very briefly in the 4th paragraph of his letter, that his employer was a widower, that the loss had been hard, and that the grief had contributed in complicated ways to the state of the ranch's affairs. Wilhelmina had not come to Texas for a widower's grief. She had come because the financial problem sounded interesting, and because Hector's letter had the careful, loyal tone of a good man trying to save something he cared about. She could respect that, even if she was not entirely sure she should be walking into a situation where her client did not know he had hired her. She had ridden out to the Double M on a borrowed horse on a Tuesday morning in early September 1883, with her satchel of working tools, her ledger paper, her pen case, and the composed expression she wore like armor in professional situations. The ranch itself had taken her breath away before she was fully prepared for it. It sat in a shallow valley between 2 limestone ridges, the main house built of the same pale stone as the hills around it, 2 stories with a wide, covered porch and green-painted shutters that someone had once taken pride in. There were outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse, several corrals, and in the distance, visible against the ridge line, a herd of longhorn cattle that even from a distance looked impressive in number. The land was dry from the summer heat but not desperate. There was a creek running along the eastern edge of the property, and the grass in the low places near the water was still green and thick. It was a beautiful place, she had thought, a place that had been built with intention and care. It was also, as Hector Vasquez confirmed when he met her at the gate with a look of profound relief on his weathered face, a place that was quietly bleeding to death through a dozen small wounds that nobody had been tending. Hector had been the one to show her to the ranch office and unlock the cabinet where the ledgers were kept. He had stood in the doorway while she opened the first one, and she had watched his expression move through several stages of complicated emotion as she began to page through the entries. "He is going to be furious when he finds out you are here," Hector had said. "He is going to be more furious in 6 months when the bank takes the property," Wilhelmina had answered. She had spent that first day alone in the office with the books. Tobias Monroe had been out on the range, which Hector told her was his standard practice, out before dawn and back near dark, working the land with an intensity that Hector described as both admirable and concerning. The man worked, Hector said, the way some men drank, as a way of not being still long enough to feel what was underneath. Wilhelmina had thought about that while she worked through the columns of numbers. She had also thought more than once that the handwriting in the ledgers changed somewhere in late 1881. Before that date, the entries were precise and detailed, each transaction recorded with careful notation. After that date, the entries became sparse, sometimes skipped entirely, and the handwriting was different, heavier and less careful, as if the person writing them was doing it under some kind of duress. She had looked at the date of the change, November 1881. She had noted it and kept working. By evening of the first day, she had a clear picture of the situation. By the morning of the second day, she had finished her analysis and written her preliminary assessment in the neat columns she used to organize financial findings. And on the morning of the third day, she had been sitting at the ranch office desk going through her notes when the door had opened without a knock and Tobias Monroe had walked in. He had stopped when he saw her, completely stopped, the way a man stops when he rounds a corner and finds a mountain lion sitting in the middle of the path. The surprise on his face was followed immediately by something else, something harder and more complicated. "Who are you?" he had said. Not a question, a demand. "My name is Wilhelmina Carver. I am an accounts examiner. Your foreman engaged my services 3 days ago. Hector engaged your services." "Yes." "Without my knowledge." "Yes." He had looked at her for a long moment, and she had looked back at him, and she had thought, in that very first moment, that he was a deeply unhappy man wearing the face of a self-sufficient one. It was a particular kind of unhappiness she recognized. The kind that came from having had something important, and then losing it, and then deciding that the safest response to loss was to need nothing and nobody ever again. She had also thought, which she would not have admitted to anyone, that he was one of the most physically striking men she had ever encountered. Not handsome in the smooth, finished way of city men, but striking in the way of something elemental, put together by the land and the work and the weather into a form that was exactly as large and solid as it needed to be. She had tucked that observation away immediately and returned her attention to the ledger. "You need to leave," he had said. "Look at the books first," she had said. And that was how they had arrived at this moment, with the ledger open between them and Tobias Monroe staring at the numbers that documented his own ruin, and Wilhelmina Carver waiting with the patience of a woman who had learned that the truth, once spoken clearly, generally did its own work. The clock on the mantel ticked through 30 seconds of silence. Then Tobias Monroe pulled his chair back and sat down. He sat down slowly, as if the weight of the numbers had just landed on his shoulders all at once, and he put both hands flat on the desk and looked at the columns Wilhelmina had marked with her pen, the debt column, the income column, the projected shortfall column, and the date column which showed September 15th in red ink. 3 months, he said. His voice had lost some of its hard edge. In its place was something rower. "Closer to 11 weeks, Wilhelmina said. She sat down across from him, which she had not been invited to do, because she had learned that sometimes you had to create the conditions for a productive conversation by simply behaving as if they already existed. "But the situation is correctable. That is what I need you to hear before anything else. It is correctable, but it requires immediate action, and it requires you to trust someone other than yourself with information about this operation." He looked up from the ledger and his pale eyes met hers. "Why should I trust you?" he said. "I do not know you. You walked into my house without my invitation. You have been sitting in my office reading my private records for 3 days. "Because I have not left," she said simply. "A woman with a hidden motive or a trap in mind does not spend 3 days in a ranch office working through 5 years of accounts ledgers. I have no interest in your land, your cattle, or your personal affairs beyond their financial dimensions. I am here because your foreman loves this ranch and wrote me a letter that made me believe it was worth saving. If you would like to argue about the propriety of my presence after the immediate crisis is resolved, I am happy to have that conversation. Right now, I need you to tell me whether you are willing to listen." Something moved through his expression. Something complicated and difficult to read, like weather coming in over a ridge. "You said the situation is correctable," he said finally. "Yes. Show me." That was how it began. Wilhelmina spent the next 2 hours walking Tobias Monroe through his own financial situation with the methodical clarity she brought to every examination. She showed him the feed costs, which had risen by 30% over 2 years and had not been renegotiated with the supplier. She showed him the cattle note, which carried an interest rate that was higher than the current market rate for secured ranch loans, and could be refinanced through a different lender in San Antonio she had worked with before. She showed him the wage records and the fact that 2 of his 6 hands had been paid nothing since March, which meant they were either deeply loyal or actively looking for other work, and either way the situation was untenable. She also showed him something else. Something she had found on the second afternoon of her examination, tucked into the back of the 1882 ledger in a folded piece of paper that she had hesitated before opening, and then decided she needed to open because it was clearly a financial document, and she needed all the financial documents to do her job accurately. It was a letter from the First Cattlemen's Bank of Hargrove County, dated January of 1882, addressed to a Mrs. Clara Monroe. The letter informed Mrs. Clara Monroe that the account she had inquired about, an account in the name of Monroe Ranch Operations, had a current balance of $4,213, and that the bank was pleased to confirm that all required documentation for the transfer of said funds had been received and was being processed. Wilhelmina had read the letter twice. Then she had folded it carefully and replaced it in the back of the ledger exactly where she found it. She had added a note to her working papers. 1882, January. Account inquiry Mrs. Clara Monroe, $4,000 plus. Transfer documentation processed. Cross-reference with current account balance. When she had cross-referenced, she had found that the $4,000 was gone from the operational account, withdrawn in a series of transactions over 6 weeks in the winter of 1882. There was no corresponding record of what those funds had been used for. There was no notation in the ledger. There was only the gap, a hole in the accounts the size of a small fortune, appearing in the months immediately following the date when the handwriting in the ledgers changed. November 1880, was when Clara Monroe died. Wilhelmina had figured that out from a combination of the changed handwriting and the date on the bank letter, which referred to an account inquiry made in the weeks before her death. She did not know the details of how Clara Monroe had died, and she did not ask, because it was not her business unless it connected to the financial problem, which it appeared to do in a way that was going to require a very careful conversation. She had not yet shown Tobias Monroe the bank letter or the gap in the 1882 accounts. She needed to understand the rest of the picture first. While she was walking him through the correctable issues, the feed costs and the note and the wages, she watched him absorb the information with the focused attention of a man who was genuinely intelligent and had simply stopped applying that intelligence to the financial dimensions of his operation. He asked good questions. He pushed back when a number seemed wrong to him, and twice he was right, catching entries she had flagged as irregular that turned out to have legitimate explanations she had not yet found in the documentation. He was, she realized, exactly the kind of person who should have been managing his own books all along. He had the mind for it. He simply had not been doing it. "You have not looked at these accounts in how long?" she asked, after they had been working together for perhaps an hour and a half. He was quiet for a moment. "Since my wife passed," he said. "She handled the books." "Clara," Wilhelmina said, and the name came out before she had fully decided to say it. He went very still. "You found her name in the records?" "Yes." He was quiet again. Outside the window, a rooster was announcing something to the yard. A horse moved in the nearest corral, its hooves soft on the packed earth. "She had a gift for it," he said finally. "Numbers, organization. She kept everything in order." "I can see that," Wilhelmina said, and meant it. The entries before November of 1881 are meticulous. Every transaction documented clearly. She was very thorough. Something in his face shifted at the acknowledgement, a small thing, but she noticed it. She was, he said. She was thorough about everything she decided to do. There was something in the way he said it, a complexity she did not yet have enough information to interpret. She took a breath and decided to show him the bank letter. She took it from her working papers, where she had placed it for safekeeping, and she set it on the desk between them without comment and watched his face. He looked at the letter. His expression did not change on the surface, but beneath the surface something moved, some deep current she could feel more than see. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "In the back of the 1882 ledger. I found it while examining the records. I was not searching for personal correspondence, but it appeared to be a financial document, and I needed to examine it to complete the account's picture." "The account's picture," he repeated slowly. "There is a gap in the 1882 accounts," she said, keeping her voice level and factual. $4,200 and some dollars, withdrawn over 6 weeks in January and February of that year. There is no notation in the ledger for what those funds were used for. I cannot complete an accurate assessment of the current financial situation without understanding that transaction. The silence this time was different from the earlier ones. It had a weight to it that felt personal rather than strategic. Tobias Monroe picked up the bank letter. He held it for a moment, looking at his late wife's name printed on it by the bank clerk's neat hand. "She was sick," he said, "before she passed." "She knew she was sick." Wilhelmina waited. "She wrote to her sister in Virginia, arranged to send money. She did not tell me until after the funds were transferred." He set the letter back on the desk. "We had an argument about it, the last significant argument we ever had, as it turned out. She died 6 weeks after that conversation." Wilhelmina let a moment pass before she spoke. "Was the transfer of funds something you ultimately agreed to?" "No," he said. "I did not agree, but I also could not undo it, and she was dying, and there were things that mattered more than money." He looked up. "Her sister was in genuine need. I understood that even at the time. I simply had not been consulted." "I see," Wilhelmina said. "Does it affect your assessment, the gap in the accounts?" "It clarifies it," she said. "I can document the transaction properly now. It was a legitimate transfer, even if it was not recorded. It changes the picture of the current deficit slightly, because it explains a period of tighter cash flow that I had attributed to other causes." She paused. "It also tells me that the current financial situation is somewhat less severe than the most conservative reading of the accounts suggested. You are in difficulty, but you are not in the absolute worst version of the difficulty I initially mapped." He looked at her for a long time. "You are very direct," he said. "I find it saves time," she said. "And in your case, time is specifically the resource in shortest supply." Something that might, in a different man under different circumstances, have become a smile crossed his face briefly. It did not fully arrive, but it visited. "What do you propose?" he said. It was the question she had been waiting for. The question that meant he was willing to listen, which meant there was something real they could work with. She spent the next hour laying out her plan. It was structured in 3 phases. The first phase addressed the immediate crisis, the upcoming note payment on September 15th, which she proposed to address by approaching the San Antonio lender she had worked with before to refinance at a lower rate and extend the payment term, buying the ranch 14 months of reduced financial pressure. The second phase addressed the operational inefficiencies, the feed contract renegotiation, the wage backlog resolution, and a restructured arrangement with the Morrison store in town that would clear the outstanding debt and establish cleaner credit terms going forward. The third phase was longer term, and it involved Tobias himself sitting down with her for a systematic review of his ranch's income and expense structure, so that he could take over his own books again with a clear understanding of what he was managing. "I have no desire to install myself as a permanent fixture in your operation," she said. "I come in, I find the problems, I help establish solutions, and I leave the business in better health than I found it. That is my work." He had been listening with his elbows on the desk and his hands clasped in front of him. Now he straightened. "And your fee for this work," he said. "Standard examination rate plus a percentage of documented savings achieved through renegotiation," she said. "I will give you the full terms in writing before I do anything further. You should not agree to anything without seeing the terms in writing." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "You just advised me to read a contract carefully before signing," he said. "Most people selling services do not say that." "I am not selling anything," she said. "I am offering a professional service." The difference matters. This time the almost smile was closer to arriving. "All right, Miss Carver," he said. "Show me the terms." She had the terms ready. She had written them out the previous evening, as she always did before a client meeting, because she believed in being prepared for the possibility that the conversation went the direction she intended it to go. She slid the paper across the desk. He read it carefully, which she respected, reading every line and asking 2 clarifying questions about the percentage structure, both of which were intelligent questions that showed he understood contracts. Then he signed it with the pen she offered him. And Tobias Monroe, who had said that morning that he did not need a partner, had changed his mind by noon. The first week of their working arrangement was professional and careful, and charged with attention that neither of them acknowledged directly. He gave her full access to the records and the office. He made himself available for questions in the evenings, after the ranch work was done, and he answered those questions with the precision of a man who was determined to be a useful client, even if he was not entirely comfortable with the situation. He introduced her to Hector with a dryness that made the foreman's relief visible and somewhat sheepish. "You hired her without telling me," Tobias said to Hector on the first morning after the contract was signed. "I was concerned," Hector said. "She came highly recommended. She is sitting in my office going through 30 years of Monroe family finances. And she knows what she is doing," Hector said, "which is more than I can say for the rest of us." Tobias had looked at his foreman for a long moment and then nodded once, which Wilhelmina, watching from the office doorway, read as the ranch equivalent of a full pardon. She liked Hector Vasquez. He was a compact, serious man in his early 40s, with silver in his dark hair and the careful authority of someone who had spent decades earning the trust of difficult men. He had worked the Double M for 18 years. He knew every acre of the property and every quirk of every animal in the herd, and his loyalty to Tobias Monroe was the genuine, clear-eyed kind that did not require the man to be perfect. "He is a good man," Hector told her one afternoon when Tobias was out on the South Range. "He has been carrying too much alone for too long. Clara's death, it broke something in him that did not quite heal right. He closed himself up afterward, stopped letting people help." "He let me help," Wilhelmina said. After some discussion, Hector smiled at that. "You did not give him a great deal of choice." "I showed him the books," she said. "The books made the argument. I simply organized them." She had arranged temporary lodging at the Hargrove boarding house in town, a clean and respectable establishment run by a Mrs. Edna Prout, who was inclined toward curiosity about Wilhelmina's presence in the area, but was also too well-mannered to pry directly. Wilhelmina rode out to the Double M each morning on the horse she had continued to borrow, a steady brown mare named Patience, who seemed to find the daily ride through the hill country hills perfectly agreeable. The landscape was doing something to her that she had not entirely anticipated. She had grown up in Missouri, which was beautiful in its own way, but Texas in autumn had a particular quality to it. The limestone cliffs going gold in the morning light, the cedar and live oak dark and permanent against the pale sky, the smell of the land in the cooling air carrying something ancient and specific that she found she could not quite name but recognized as significant. She was not a sentimental woman. She did not think of herself as someone who was affected by landscape. But the hill country was affecting her, and she was honest enough with herself to notice it even while she filed the observation away as irrelevant to the work. On the 4th day of the new working arrangement, she rode out to the South Range with Hector to look at the cattle, because She believed in understanding the physical reality of any operation she was examining financially. The herd was impressive, nearly 400 head of longhorns in varying states of condition, some of them exceptional animals that she could see even with her non-expert eye would bring strong prices at the right market. The cattle are not the problem, Hector confirmed. The herd quality has actually improved over the last 2 years. He has put a great deal of work into breeding selections. While the books were going unmanaged, Wilhelmina said. He knows cattle, Hector said. He does not know how to be two people at once. She thought about that observation more than once over the following days. The feed contract renegotiation happened first because it was the most immediate operational saving and because it required a trip to town that she could accomplish in one morning. The feed supplier, a man named Garrett, was initially resistant to the idea of adjusting prices for the Double M's account because he had grown accustomed to the existing arrangement and because he had apparently formed the impression that Tobias Monroe was not particularly engaged with the financial details of his ranch operations. Wilhelmina corrected that impression politely, and with complete factual documentation of comparable feed prices from 3 other suppliers within reasonable transport distance. Garrett reconsidered his position within approximately 20 minutes and agreed to a price reduction of 12% and net 45 payment terms. She reported the result to Tobias that evening over the working dinner. They had begun to share in the ranch house kitchen because it was more efficient to eat while reviewing the day's financial developments than to interrupt the work twice. The kitchen arrangement had emerged naturally over the first week. Tobias's regular cook, a taciturn man named Abel who had been with the ranch for a dozen years and produced food that was plain and adequate and exactly calibrated to the needs of working cowboys, served dinner at 6 o'clock. Tobias had initially invited Wilhelmina to stay for dinner on her 3rd day on practical grounds, pointing out that the road back to town was unpredictable in the dark and that it made more sense to finish the evening's discussion before she rode in. She had agreed on practical grounds. By the end of the first week, the dinner had become the natural conclusion of each working day, and she had stopped thinking of it as a logistical arrangement and started thinking of it as something she looked forward to. He was a different person across a dinner table than he was in the morning hours. Not softer exactly, but less armored. He talked about the cattle with a passion that was entirely unguarded, describing the breeding decisions and the pasture management with the detail of a man who had given his whole mind and heart to the work for years. He talked about the land itself with a reverence that surprised her, pointing out through the kitchen window on clear evenings how the ridge line looked in the last light, explaining the geological history of the limestone formations in terms he had apparently absorbed from some book that she inferred he had read more than once. He was also, she discovered, quietly funny. Not in a showy way, but in the way of a person who had an exact and precise sense of the absurd, and occasionally let it surface in a single dry observation that arrived before you were quite expecting it, so that you were laughing before you had time to decide whether the joke warranted it. She did not laugh often in professional settings. She was laughing more in this kitchen than she had laughed anywhere in some time. She did not examine this fact too closely during the first week. She was a professional. She was here to do a job. The job was going well, which was what mattered. On the 9th day, Tobias Monroe said something that made it harder to keep her professional distance in good repair. They had finished reviewing the draft refinancing proposal she had prepared for the San Antonio lender, a careful document that she was confident would achieve the rate reduction she had projected. He had read it twice and asked 4 good questions and then signed the letter that would accompany it. In the quiet after the signing, while she was organizing the papers back into the proper order, he said, without looking up from the desk, "My wife would have liked you." She stopped organizing the papers. She had the same directness, he said. The same way of not letting people hide from things that needed to be looked at directly. He paused. She would have found the situation we are currently in mortifying. The disorganization of the accounts, she would have had very pointed things to say about it. You have not been mortified enough, Wilhelmina said carefully. But you have been dealing with a grief that was not straightforward, and the accounts reflect that. It is not a character failure. It is a human response to an impossible situation. He looked up at her then. That is a generous reading, he said. It is an accurate reading, she said. I have examined the records carefully enough to know the difference. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for professional exchange. Then he said, You said you were from Missouri. Jefferson City, she said. What made you come to Texas? Work, she said, and the sense that I was not quite finished growing into what I was meant to be. And have you, he said. Finished growing into it? She considered the question seriously, because he had asked it seriously. Not yet, she said, but I think I am getting closer. He nodded once, as if this were an answer he recognized, as if it described something about his own experience that he had not quite put into words before. She rode back to the boarding house that evening with the night air cool on her face and the stars extraordinarily present overhead, and she admitted to herself, quietly and without drama, that she was in a certain amount of trouble. Not financial trouble, that she was handling competently. The other kind. The next 2 weeks moved at the pace of genuine work, which is to say quickly and with focus, and with the particular satisfaction of watching a complex problem respond to organized effort. The refinancing letter went to San Antonio and came back with a positive preliminary response within 10 days, which was faster than Wilhelmina had projected. The lender, whose name was Harmon, had worked with her before on 2 ranch accounts and trusted her assessments. He sent a representative to examine the Double M property, a young man named Collins who rode out with his own ledger and spent a day walking the land and looking at the cattle with the practiced eye of a man who understood collateral. Collins had apparently come back to San Antonio with a favorable report, because Harmon's follow-up letter offered terms that were better than Wilhelmina had asked for, a full 2 percentage points below the current note rate and a repayment structure that gave the ranch 18 months of reduced payment obligations. She showed Tobias the letter at dinner. He read it. Then he set it down and looked at her across the table. You projected a 1.5 point reduction, he said. I did, she said. This is 2 points. Yes. How? Collins saw the herd, she said simply. The cattle quality justified it. I told you the cattle were not the problem. Harmon agreed, apparently. Something happened in Tobias Monroe's expression that she had not seen there before. It was not the almost smile or the dry amusement or the guarded professional appreciation. It was something more open than any of those, and it arrived too quickly for him to manage it into something more contained. He was pleased. Genuinely, fully pleased and surprised, and the combination of the two had gotten past his considerable defenses before he could organize them. Wilhelmina, he said, just her name. No title, no Miss Carver. Just the name, said in the voice of a man who had momentarily forgotten to be careful. She felt it like a struck match somewhere in her chest. It is good news, she said, keeping her voice level with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to manage their own internal weather. We should discuss the acceptance terms this evening so we can send the response by the end of the week. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he said, yes, we should, and reached for his pen. But something had shifted between them, fine and definite as a change in the direction of the wind. The wages issue resolved itself through a conversation that Tobias had with his 2 most loyal hands, the ones who had continued working without full pay since March. Their names were Peg and Santos, both men in their 30s, both with years on the Double M behind them. Tobias sat down with each of them privately and explained the situation and the plan for resolution. He told Wilhelmina about it the next evening. Peg told me I was a fool for not saying something sooner, he said. Santos told me that Hector had told them things would be all right when the accounts examiner arrived, and that he had been right. Hector was confident before I arrived, she said. Hector is confident in his ability to identify capable people, Tobias said. He told me he had not been wrong about that in 30 years and did not expect to start now. He paused. He was not wrong. She absorbed this without letting it show too clearly in her face, which required more effort than it should have. The Morrison store account, she said, redirecting the conversation to safer ground. I would like to address that this week. I have spoken with Morrison in passing, and I believe there is room to negotiate the outstanding balance against a new forward credit arrangement that is more structured. You spoke with Morrison, he said, briefly, in town on Wednesday. He was hesitant at first, but open to conversation. Tobias looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as the one he wore when she had done something he had not anticipated and was deciding how to feel about it. You have been talking to my creditors without telling me, he said. Preliminary conversations only, she said. Nothing binding. I would not take any binding action without your knowledge or approval. Unlike some people who walk into my office uninvited, he said. She could tell from his tone that this was not the accusation it would have been 2 weeks ago. It had become something else, a piece of shared history between them, gently referenced. Unlike that, yes, she said. I have learned from the example. He smiled then, a real one finally. It was not a large smile, but it arrived completely, and it changed his face in a way that she had not been ready for. She decided immediately and firmly that she needed to be ready for it henceforth, because being caught unprepared by Tobias Monroe's smile was a vulnerability she could not afford. She was already considerably compromised, and she knew it. The Morrison negotiation happened on a Friday morning, and Tobias came with her for that one, which she had suggested, and he had agreed to without argument, which was itself a development. 2 weeks ago he would have argued about anything that implied he needed assistance with a business conversation in his own town. Morrison was a reasonable man who had extended the Monroe account out of a combination of personal loyalty and financial hope, and who had spent 9 months trying to decide whether to feel betrayed or patient about the fact that neither attitude had produced any payment. He was initially wary of Wilhelmina, because he was a traditional man who was not accustomed to women being the principal negotiator in a business meeting, but Tobias's presence and his evident endorsement of Wilhelmina's authority settled the question quickly. They left Morrison's store 40 minutes later with a written agreement that cleared the outstanding debt on a structured 6-month payment plan and established new credit terms going forward that were cleaner and more manageable for both parties. On the walk back to where their horses were tied, Tobias said, "You thanked him for his patience before you asked for anything." "Yes," she said. "Why?" "Because he had been patient," she said, "for 9 months. That is real, and it deserved acknowledgement before the negotiation began. People negotiate better when they feel seen." He considered this. "Where did you learn that?" "My father," she said. "He was a bank examiner. He said the most important thing in any financial conversation was that both parties felt the conversation was happening in good faith. You establish good faith first, then you talk about money." "He sounds like a wise man," Tobias said. "He was," she said. "I miss him every day." It was more personal than she usually allowed herself to be in professional settings. But they had been walking together in the September sunshine with the hill country spread around them, and the morning air still carrying some of its night coolness, and the words had come out before the professional part of her could stop them. Tobias did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter. "I understand that," he said. "The missing." They walked the last distance to the horses in a silence that was not uncomfortable at all. Hargrove County in September was settling into the particular rhythm of a Texas hill country autumn, the days still warm but the mornings and evenings carrying the first hints of the coming season. The persimmons were beginning to color in the creek bottoms, and in the evenings the sky went through shades of orange and red over the western ridge that Wilhelmina had taken to pausing in the yard to watch before she rode back to town. One evening, Tobias came to stand beside her while she watched. He did not say anything, and neither did she. They stood about 3 feet apart and watched the western sky do its slow, extraordinary work, and she was aware of his presence the way you are aware of something large and warm standing near you, not intrusive, but unmistakably there. After several minutes he said, "My father built this house to face east, so the front porch caught the morning sun. But this is the view that earned the land." "It is extraordinary," she said. "Clara used to say it was payment," he said, "for everything hard about living here. The drought and the isolation and the distance from the places she had grown up knowing. She said when the sky was like this in the evening, it was the land paying you back." "That is a beautiful way to think about it," Wilhelmina said. "She was a poet sometimes," he said, "about the things she loved." He said it without pain, she noticed, with a sadness that had become gentle rather than sharp. She glanced at him. He was watching the sky with an expression that was simply present, not performing anything, not managing anything, just watching. "I think she was right," Wilhelmina said, "about the payment." He looked at her then. In the last of the warm light, with the orange sky behind the ridge, his pale eyes were almost amber. "I think so too," he said. The moment held between them, fine and fragile as the line where the sky met the ridge. Then she said she needed to get back to town before dark, and he nodded and walked her to the horse. And when he handed her the reins, his fingers brushed hers for a moment in a way that neither of them commented on. She rode back toward Hargrove in the gathering dusk with her heart doing something complicated and entirely uninvited, and she had the distinct and uncomfortable feeling that she was no longer entirely in command of the situation. The professional part of the work was nearly complete. 3 weeks in, and the essential crises had been addressed. The refinancing was arranged. The wages would be cleared by the end of October from the improved cash flow the refinancing created. The feed contract and the Morrison account were sorted. She had also, in her remaining time, reorganized the filing system in the ranch office, reconciled the accounts through to the current date, and written out a clear monthly accounting protocol that Tobias could follow to keep the books in order going forward. She had one final session with him planned, a thorough walkthrough of the new system so that he could take it over himself. After that, by her own professional standard, her job was done. She spent the night before that final session lying awake in the narrow bed at the boarding house, listening to the town settle into quiet around her, and having a very honest conversation with herself about what she was going to do. The honest answer was that she did not know. She knew what the professional situation called for. It called for her to conduct the final session, collect her fee, write up her report, and ride the stage back toward San Antonio or wherever the next inquiry came from. That was what she did. That was what she was. She also knew, with the same clarity that she brought to columns of numbers, that she had never once in her professional career found herself standing in a ranch yard watching the sky go orange and amber alongside a client, and feeling that the distance between them was the wrong distance. She had not expected this. She had expected to find a financial problem and solve it and move on. She had not expected Tobias Monroe, the actual full weight of him, the intelligence and the stubbornness and the hidden humor and the grief he was learning to carry with some grace, and the way he listened when she talked, not waiting for his turn to speak but actually listening, as if what she said was worth hearing. She had not expected to matter to him, but she thought, lying in the dark in the boarding house, that she might. She thought he might matter to her in ways that were going to outlast a professional engagement. She rode out to the Double M the next morning with the discipline of someone who has decided to simply do the next right thing and trust that the subsequent right things will clarify themselves. The final session was thorough and good. They worked through the new accounting system together, with her explaining and him asking questions and writing careful notes in a new ledger she had prepared for him, and she felt, watching him work, that he was taking it seriously in a way that went beyond the immediate practical need. He was taking it seriously because he had decided that this was something he needed to know how to do, something he owed the ranch and the people on it. By midday they had worked through everything. She closed her own working ledger and began to pack her satchel. He watched her do it from across the desk. "You are leaving," he said. "The work is complete," she said. "I will have the final report to you within a week. The accounts are in order. The system I have written out will serve you well if you use it consistently." "Wilhelmina," he said. She looked up. He was leaning forward with both hands flat on the desk, in the same position she had first seen him in on the morning when he had stared at the ledger, and the truth of his situation had landed on him all at once. But his expression now was entirely different. It was not the expression of a man who has been cornered by unwelcome facts. It was the expression of a man who has made up his mind about something and is about to say it out loud before he can think better of it. "I do not want you to leave," he said. "Not yet, perhaps not at all." The satchel was in her hands. She did not set it down and she did not continue packing it. "That requires some specification," she said carefully. "I know," he said. "I am not particularly practiced at this kind of conversation. I am going to ask you to bear with me while I have it." "I am a patient woman," she said, which was not entirely true in all contexts but was true in this one. He stood up from the desk and came around to her side of it, which she had not expected, and stood perhaps 2 feet in front of her, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes and the careful way he was holding his own expression together. "I have been alone for 2 years," he said. "And before that I was with Clara, and before that I was alone, and I have in general treated my own solitude as a sufficient state of being. I decided, after she died, that I was a man who was complete in himself and did not require companionship beyond the professional and the practical." "You told me as much on the first morning," she said. "You did not need a partner." "I was wrong," he said, "and I was wrong before noon, as it turned out." Something warm and completely unguarded moved through her chest. "You are a remarkable woman," he said. "You are the most competent person who has walked through the door of this house since Clara ran it. You are direct and honest, and you do not let people hide from necessary truths, and you have the best mind for numbers I have encountered in my life, which includes 15 years of cattle business with some sharp people in it." He paused. "You also watch the evening sky as if it has something to say, and you laugh at the right things, and you told me something about your father that made me understand you better, and I find that I do not want the days to stop containing you." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is a very thorough inventory," she said. "I tend toward thoroughness when the matter is important," he said. "I noticed," she said. She set the satchel down on the desk. "I am not a woman who makes decisions based on sentiment," she said carefully, because she needed him to understand this about her from the beginning. "I am also not a woman who refuses to recognize something real when it is directly in front of her. What is happening here is something real. I believe that. I also believe that we are 2 careful people who have both been hurt by loss in different ways, and who should not mistake the intensity of a difficult professional situation for something more than it is." "Do you believe that?" he said. "That it might be a mistake." She thought about it. She gave it the serious consideration she gave everything that mattered. "No," she said, "I do not actually believe it is a mistake. I believe it is the most unexpected and least anticipated thing that has happened to me in quite some time, and I believe that you mean what you are saying, and I believe that I have been in a certain amount of trouble about you since roughly the 7th day." "The 7th day," he said. "What happened on the 7th day?" "You told me my renegotiation of the feed contract was good work," she said. "And you said it the way people say things they actually mean, not the way they say them to be polite." Something in him shifted, and this time the smile arrived fully and completely and without any hesitation at all. He reached out and took her hand. Just her hand carefully, the way a man handles something he wants to be certain of. His hand was large and work-roughened and warm. "Will you stay?" he said. "Not as an accounts examiner, just as yourself. Whatever that looks like going forward. I am not certain what shape it takes from here. I only know that the shape it takes should include you in it." Wilhelmina Carver, who was not a sentimental woman and who had driven 3 days across Texas Hill Country on a borrowed horse to look at a stranger's ledgers, who had reorganized her life 3 times already in pursuit of the next right thing, who had stood in the dark office of a prideful, solitary rancher and shown him the truth of his own situation, and waited while he found the courage to look at it directly, thought about all the distances she had traveled to arrive at this particular point. "Yes," she said, "I will stay." What followed was not simple, because nothing between two people who are both substantially themselves is ever simple, but it was good in the ways that matter. She sent word to Mrs. Prout at the boarding house that she would be extending her stay in Hargrove County indefinitely. She wrote to her current network of professional contacts, explaining that she was taking a reduced caseload for the foreseeable future. She kept her professional identity intact, which Tobias supported entirely, because he was not a man who wanted a different kind of woman than the one he had actually encountered, and he had encountered a woman who was good at her work and knew it, and had no interest in pretending otherwise. She continued to manage the double M accounts, but on a different footing now, as a genuine partner in the operation rather than a hired examiner. She formalized this with a business agreement that she wrote and he reviewed and they both signed, because she believed in documentation, and he had learned in the previous weeks to share that belief. She moved into the ranch house in early October, into the room that had been a guest room since Clara's death, while they conducted themselves with the propriety that the county expected, and that they both considered appropriate given that they were in the early stages of something they were taking seriously. Hargrove County noticed. Hargrove County had opinions. This was the nature of small communities, and Wilhelmina had spent enough of her professional life in small communities to have developed a practical relationship with being noticed. She held herself with the dignity of a woman who was doing nothing wrong and needed no one's approval for it, which tended to quiet most commentary eventually. Tobias's response to the community observation was characteristically economical. He told the 2 or 3 men who made comments directly to him that Miss Carver was a business partner of the double M and a person of his high personal regard, and that he considered any opinion to the contrary to be the speaker's problem rather than his. The men stopped commenting. What grew between them over those autumn months was the kind of love that forms between people who have both been tested by real difficulty and have come through it with their essential characters intact. It was not the love of the young and untested, full of beautiful illusions about what people are. It was the love of 2 people who had looked at each other clearly, including the difficult parts, and chosen each other anyway. He showed her the cattle operation in full, taking her out on the range on autumn mornings when the air was sharp and the grass was gold, and the longhorns moved across the landscape with the prehistoric gravity of animals that belonged entirely to this land. She learned to ride properly, taking lessons from Hector with a determination that made the foreman's eyes warm with something that looked like satisfaction. She showed him how to keep the books with a clarity and consistency that would serve him through whatever came, and she watched him take to it with the same focused intelligence he brought to everything he decided to learn, the same way he had read the refinancing proposal with genuine attention and the feed contract with genuine curiosity. He had always been a man who could learn. He had simply needed the right teacher and the right reason. In November, on an evening when the first real cold of the season had come in off the north, and the fireplace in the main room was doing its essential work, he asked her to marry him. He did it with the same directness and thoroughness that she had come to love about him. He was not flowery. He was precise. He told her what she was to him and what he hoped they would be to each other, and what the life he was offering looked like in honest practical terms, including the difficulties and the uncertainties of ranching life and the distances from the cities she had lived in before. She told him that she had not come to Texas looking for this, and that she was grateful every day that she had found it anyway. She told him yes. They were married in the Hargrove County Church on a Saturday in early December of 1883, in a ceremony that was attended by Hector Vasquez and his wife Maria, the hands Peg and Santos and their families, the Morrison family from the general store, and a small collection of county neighbors who had, in the week since the engagement was announced, revised their opinions of Wilhelmina Carver upward from various starting points and arrived at something approaching respect. Mrs. Prude attended and cried, which she would have denied if asked. Tobias wore his best coat and his cleanest boots and stood at the front of the church with the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he had given up believing he would ever arrive. Wilhelmina wore a dress of dark blue wool she had ordered from San Antonio, and she walked into the church on her own, because there was no family to walk her in, and she did so with the straight spine and the steady eyes of a woman who was entirely certain of where she was going and entirely glad of it. She met his eyes from the far end of the aisle, and he was watching her with an expression that was undefended and unmanaged and wholly present, and she thought that she had solved many difficult problems in her professional life, and this was the best one. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was what winters in the Texas Hill Country generally were, unpredictable and occasionally fierce. There were 2 ice storms that kept everyone close to the house for days at a time. There were mornings when the creek froze at its edges, and the cattle had to be watered from the troughs near the barn that Tobias and the hands kept free of ice by hand. Inside the ranch house, those ice storm days were warm and close and good. They read together in the evenings, which she had not expected him to be a person who did, but which he turned out to be enthusiastically, with a particular fondness for histories and natural science texts that he ordered from a bookseller in San Antonio, with the methodical regularity of a man who took his reading seriously. She lent him her father's copy of a financial management text that she had carried from Missouri, which he read with the careful annotation of a student who intends to remember what he has learned. He taught her chess, which he played with the same strategic patience he brought to cattle management, looking several moves ahead and waiting without anxiety for his plans to develop. She was a quick learner, and within 6 weeks was beating him with enough regularity that the games became genuinely competitive, which he found more satisfying than winning against an opponent who was not yet his equal. "You are competitive," she told him one evening after she had taken a game in 32 moves. "I am," he admitted. "I hide it reasonably well in most areas of life, not in chess." "I am also competitive," she said. "I hide it somewhat less well." "I know," he said. "It is one of the things I love about you." He said it simply, as he said most important things without ornamentation. "I love about you, present and real." She had been arranging the chess pieces for another game. She stopped arranging them and looked at him across the board. "I love you, Tobias," she said with the same simplicity. He reached across the board and took her hand. "I know," he said, echoing her words of the previous exchange with a precision that told her he had been listening. "I know." Spring came to the hill country with the extravagance of a season that has been stored up under the ice and is ready to spend itself all at once. The bluebonnets came in along the roadsides and in the pastures, turning the whole landscape the color of a summer sky reflected downward. The cattle came through the winter in good condition, and the spring calves arrived in a rush that kept everyone busy from before dawn until after dark. Wilhelmina worked alongside the ranch operations, with an involvement that had grown naturally over the months, not abandoning her professional identity, but weaving it into the life of the Double M in ways that made both better. She kept the books with the meticulous attention she had always brought to accounts, and she had begun to develop an additional service that she offered to 3 neighboring ranches through correspondence, providing quarterly accounts reviews that she could conduct without leaving home. The neighboring ranch business had been Tobias's idea, actually. He had mentioned to the owner of the Ray's cattle operation, which adjoined the Double M to the east, that his wife was an accounts examiner of considerable skill, and the Ray's owner had written her a letter within the week. "You are my business development office," she told Tobias when the 3rd neighboring inquiry arrived. "I am supporting my wife's professional standing," he said, "which is a different thing." "It is not entirely a different thing," she said. "Perhaps not entirely," he agreed. The Double M's financial situation by spring of 1884 was not merely stable but genuinely healthy. The refinancing had done its intended work, reducing the debt service pressure enough that the operational income could start building reserves rather than simply covering obligations. Tobias had used the breathing room to make 2 carefully considered investments in the herd, bringing in 3 exceptional breeding bulls from a ranch south of San Antonio, whose bloodlines he had been tracking for 2 years. The cattle market that spring was favorable, and when Tobias drove the fall steers in October of 1884, the Double M turned its first genuine profit in 3 years. He showed her the final number with the same seriousness that she had shown him the catastrophe in the books a year before. She looked at the figure. Then she looked at him. "You did this," she said. "We did this," he said. "You did the cattle work," she said. "I did the accounting." "The cattle work is the one that generates the income. The accounting is the one that told me what I was doing and what it was worth," he said. "One without the other is half a ranch." She thought about that. Then she said, "That is a fair accounting." He laughed, a real full laugh that she had worked hard to earn over the previous year and had not stopped treasuring every time it arrived. In the spring of 1885, Wilhelmina told him she was expecting their first child. She told him in the morning in the kitchen, with the coffee still brewing and the early light coming in gold through the east-facing windows, in the pragmatic, direct way she did most things. He went very still for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put his arms around her with a gentleness that had always surprised her in a man of his physical scale, and held her carefully, and said nothing for a long while. When he did speak, he said simply, "Thank you." "For what?" she said. "For staying," he said. "For all of it." Their son was born in November of 1885, a substantial and opinionated boy who arrived with a pair of lungs that he used with enthusiasm and a head of dark hair that he got from his mother. They named him Gerald James Monroe, Gerald for Wilhelmina's father and James for Tobias's grandfather, the man who had first built on the Double M land. Gerald Monroe proved from his earliest weeks to be a child of strong character and decided preferences, which surprised neither of his parents. The ranch continued to grow through the late 1880s, carefully, and with the kind of steady intention that Wilhelmina and Tobias both brought to everything they decided to build together. They added acreage to the east when the adjoining land came available in 1887, land that included a reliable second water source, which Tobias had identified years before as the piece that would complete the ranch's long-term security. She negotiated the land purchase price. He selected the acreage and identified the water rights. It was a very satisfying division of expertise. Hector Vasquez continued as foreman through these years, his silver hair going entirely white by 1887, his authority over the operation unchallenged, and his loyalty to the Monroe family settled into something that looked very much like the loyalty of a person who has found exactly the right place to spend his life's best work. His wife Maria had become a genuine friend to Wilhelmina, the kind of friendship that grows between 2 pragmatic women who respect each other's competence and share a tolerant amusement about the particular stubbornness of the men they had married. Peg and Santos both stayed with the Double M through the decade, their wages now reliably and punctually paid on the 1st of every month without exception, a point of personal honor for Tobias that Wilhelmina found both admirable and endearing. The boarding house in Hargrove eventually came under the ownership of a new proprietor when Mrs. Prout retired in 1888, and the new owner sought out Wilhelmina for an accounts review that Wilhelmina performed with the same efficiency she brought to everything, at a rate that fairly reflected the considerably cleaner condition of her professional reputation by that point. In the autumn of 1888, Gerald Monroe turned 3, and began the process of taking over the ranch yard in the manner of a small person who has decided that the world belongs to him and is setting about confirming this hypothesis one corner at a time. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's pale skin, and some combination of both of their stubbornnesses that operated on a principle of multiplication rather than addition. He was also, when he was not engaged in his various territorial enterprises, the kind of delightful company that made both parents periodically stop what they were doing just to watch him exist. "He is going to be a great deal of work," Tobias said one evening, watching Gerald attempt to explain something at length to one of the barn cats. "He is already a great deal of work," Wilhelmina said. "He gets that from his mother," Tobias said. "He absolutely does not," she said, and the look she gave him over the top of her account book was the look that, after 5 years of marriage, still made something warm move through him reliably. A second child came in 1889, a girl they named Clara Rose Monroe, Clara for Tobias's first wife, which had been Wilhelmina's suggestion, offered simply and without complexity, because she was not a woman given to small jealousies, and because she understood that the past was not a threat to the present but part of what had built it. Tobias had looked at her for a long moment when she suggested the name, and then taken her hand. Clara Rose Monroe arrived with considerably more equanimity than her brother had managed. A calm and observant infant who studied the world with an expression of scientific interest that made Wilhelmina think often of her father. By 1890, the Double M was one of the most financially stable cattle operations in Hargrove County, a fact that was documented in Wilhelmina's accounts and reflected in the quiet confidence with which Tobias conducted his business, and in the way other ranchers sought his opinion about market conditions and cattle management decisions. He had become, by the application of intelligence and honest work and the willingness to finally let someone help him see his own situation clearly, a man whom the county respected. He had also become, more importantly, a man who was genuinely happy. He was not the same kind of happy he had been before, because he was not the same person, and the life he had built with Wilhelmina was not the life he had imagined when he was young and Clara was alive. But it was a full happiness, grounded in the actual substance of things, in the land and the cattle and the morning light on the limestone ridges, and the sound of his children in the yard, and the presence of Wilhelmina Carver Monroe at the desk across from him in the evenings, bent over her account books with the focused attention of a woman doing work she was genuinely built for. She had come in the front door with a borrowed horse and a satchel full of ledger paper and the absolute certainty that the truth, once clearly shown, had the power to change things. She had been right. On a September evening in 1890, almost exactly 7 years from the morning, she had walked into the Double M Ranch office and put the truth of a man's situation in front of him with the steadiness of someone who has nothing to hide and everything to offer. Wilhelmina and Tobias Monroe stood in the ranch yard and watched the western sky do its extraordinary work again. The colors were different every evening, which was one of the things she had come to love about this view, the way it was never quite the same twice, but always exactly what it was supposed to be. Tonight it was deep orange fading to rose fading to the first serious purple of coming night, and the ridge line was black against it, and the longhorns on the south pasture were dark moving shapes against the golden grass, and somewhere in the house behind them Gerald was explaining something important to his younger sister in the carrying tones of a 5-year-old who is certain he is right. "He has your certainty," Tobias said, listening. "And your stubbornness," she said. "The combination is going to be formidable," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I expect we will be proud of him." He put his arm around her shoulders, the comfortable, settled weight of 7 years of habit and of genuine love that had chosen itself fresh every day within the dailiness of real life. "I was thinking," he said, "about whether we have enough room in the north pasture to add 20 head to the spring calving projection." "We do," she said, "but the feed budget will need adjustment." I looked at it last week. You looked at it last week, he repeated. I thought you might be considering it, she said. You know my cattle decisions before I make them, he said. I know your cattle decisions when they are good ones, she said. The others I let you discover on your own. He made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and an acknowledgement. The North Pasture, she said. I can have the revised projections for you by Thursday. I know you can, he said. The sky continued its slow transformation. Gerald's voice from the house resolved into a more peaceful register, which probably meant Clara Rose had agreed with whatever he was explaining. 7 years ago this month, Tobias said, not quite beginning a sentence. Yes, she said, I told you I did not need a partner. You did. I was wrong about that within the first hour, he said. I was too stubborn to say so until noon. You were looking at the books, she said. The books required your full attention. They did, he said, but so did you. She leaned into his arm slightly in the manner of a woman who has decided that the workday is finished and the evening has a different character entirely. The books are in excellent order, she said. I checked this morning. I know, he said. I checked this afternoon. She turned to look at him with an expression of genuine surprise. You checked the books. I do check the books, he said, with a mild defensiveness that she recognized as performed rather than real. I have been checking the books since 1883. Occasionally, she said. Regularly, he said, when I am not otherwise occupied. You are almost always otherwise occupied, she said. I am occupied with keeping the cattle alive and profitable, he said, which is what generates the income that appears in the books, and I consider that a reasonable division of labor. It is a perfectly reasonable division of labor, she said. I have always thought so. He looked at her. In the fading light, with her dark hair loosened from its daytime arrangement and her expression carrying the particular ease of evenings at home, she was so entirely herself that he felt the familiar thing that had started in the 7th day of their professional relationship and had not stopped since, the recognition of a person who was exactly right. I love you, Wilhelmina, he said. I know, she said. I love you, Tobias. Simple, direct. Exactly true. The stars were beginning to arrive overhead, one by one, in the way they always did in the Texas Hill Country, appearing as if they had been there all along and were simply becoming visible. The night air carried the smell of cedar and dried grass, and the distant wood smoke from the bunkhouse where Hector and the hands were finishing the day. Inside the house, Clara Rose Monroe made a sound of absolute delight about something, and Gerald Monroe's voice, though quieter now, took on the tone of an older sibling who is secretly pleased to have made the younger one happy. Tobias and Wilhelmina stayed in the yard a little longer, in the warm dark, watching their land settle into night. The double M was whole, the accounts were in order, and two people who had come to each other through the clean, uncompromising honesty of numbers and need, and the unexpected courage of looking at the truth without flinching, stood together in the yard of a ranch that had nearly been lost, and was now fully, completely, irreversibly saved, and listened to their children's voices, and knew themselves to be, by every possible measure, exactly where they were supposed to be.